What if the greatest empires in history never actually owned the land beneath their feet? Picture this: a world where power flowed not through conquered territories or fortified castles, but along shimmering sea lanes and river networks, where influence was measured by the mastery of currents and the loyalty of distant ports. For thousands of years, long before satellites or global positioning, ancient civilizations turned the world's oceans into their domain, building what historians call Thalassocracies, floating empires that ruled the waves without ever needing to claim vast stretches of soil. These were societies built on movement, connection, and an intimate dance with the elements, and their stories remain some of history's most overlooked and breathtaking achievements. Think about the world you know: empires defined by borders, by armies marching across continents, by kings and queens ruling from stationary thrones. Now imagine something entirely different: empires that existed in motion, whose heartbeats were the rhythms of tides and trade winds, whose wealth traveled not in chests buried deep within stone keeps, but in the holds of ships sailing between vibrant, cosmopolitan ports. From the Phoenicians, whose merchant vessels knitted together the entire Mediterranean, to the Srivijaya Empire, which controlled the vital straits of Southeast Asia for centuries, these weren't just traders or explorers. They were architects of a new kind of power, one that thrived on adaptability, cultural exchange, and sheer nautical brilliance. In this video, we're setting sail into the deep and often mysterious past to uncover how these floating empires functioned, how they managed to project authority across thousands of miles of open water, and why their innovative approaches to governance, economics, and technology still echo in our modern world. We'll explore stunning naval innovations, delve into the complex networks of tribute and trade that fueled their prosperity, and piece together how cultures spread, merged, and evolved across these liquid highways. You're about to discover histories that challenge the very idea of what an empire can be, and by the end, you may never look at a map or the sea the same way again. So come aboard as we journey back to a time when the ocean was not a barrier, but a throne room, and the greatest rulers were those who could command it. What if the greatest power in the ancient world wasn't held by the empire with the largest army or the most sprawling farms, but by the civilization that mastered the sea itself? This is the central idea behind thalassocracy, a term that comes from the Greek words thalassa, meaning sea, and krotos, meaning power or rule. A thalassocracy is quite literally an empire built on the rule of the ocean. But this concept is so much more than just a fancy word for having a good navy. It represents a completely different philosophy of power compared to the land-based empires we often picture. Think of Rome with its vast network of roads and legions marching to secure new borders, or ancient Egypt, its prosperity rooted in the fertile, predictable floodplain of the Nile. These are Terracracy's powers defined by the dirt they stand on. Their strength was measured in acres, their security in walls and fortresses. A thalassocracy flips this entire model on its head. Its domain isn't a shaded area on a map. It's a web of shimmering blue lines connecting bustling port cities and strategic choke points. Its wealth doesn't come from taxing farmers, but from controlling the flow of trade between everyone else. Its power isn't projected by legions stationed in conquered towns, but by fleets that can appear on the horizon anywhere, anytime, to protect their interests or enforce their will. This maritime model offered incredible advantages. Without the enormous cost of garrisoning and administering vast inland territories, thalassocracies could be remarkably agile and efficient. Their influence could extend thousands of miles from a very small homeland, creating networks of wealth and cultural exchange that were far more resilient than any single border. They became the essential connectors of the ancient world, the middlemen who made global trade possible long before the word global even existed. They fostered societies that were inherently cosmopolitan, built on the constant movement of goods, people, and ideas across the water. Understanding this distinction is the first step to appreciating the genius of the floating empires. They looked at the terrifying, unpredictable open ocean and saw not a barrier but a highway. Not a void but a territory to be mastered. They understood that sometimes the most powerful throne isn't made of stone, but of wood and wave. Nestled along the narrow coastal strip of the Levant, in what is now Lebanon, the Phoenicians never had the vast farmlands or mineral wealth of their neighbors. What they did have was the sea at their doorstep and an extraordinary talent for turning it into their greatest asset. They looked at the endless blue of the Mediterranean and saw not a boundary but a promise of connection, commerce, and a unique kind of power that didn't require the heavy boot of an occupying army. Their story begins around 1500 BCE, and for over a millennium they would become the undisputed masters of maritime trade, building an empire of influence that was almost entirely liquid. Their strategy was brilliant in its simplicity and focus. Instead of waging costly wars to conquer and hold large swaths of territory, they established a constellation of strategic trading posts and colonies along the entire Mediterranean coastline. Think of these not as settlements for mass migration, but as sophisticated commercial ports, ancient versions of international free trade zones. They founded Cadiz in Spain, a gateway to the Atlantic and the precious metals of the West. They built a powerful presence on Cyprus, a vital source of copper, and most famously they established Carthage in North Africa, which would eventually grow into a major power in its own right. Each of these nodes was chosen not for its agricultural potential, but for its strategic location, creating an unbreakable chain of safe harbors and resupply points that knitted the entire sea into a Phoenician-controlled network. The goods that flowed through this network were the luxury items that defined status and power in the ancient world. From their famous coastal cities like Tyre and Sidon, they produced a vibrant purple dye, so rare and expensive that it became known as Tyrian purple, a color associated exclusively with royalty for centuries. They were master glassmakers, creating both raw glass and exquisite finished vessels. And perhaps most crucially for their own enterprise, they harvested the magnificent cedar woods from the mountains behind their cities, timber that was not only prized by foreign kings for construction, but was absolutely essential for building their own unparalleled fleet of ships. Their maritime technology was their crown jewel. They perfected the design of the bireme, a sleek, fast galley powered by 2 banks of oarsmen, and often fitted with a deadly bronze ram at the prow. This vessel was the backbone of their power, capable of both defending their merchant convoys from pirates and ensuring that their commercial terms were respected. But their innovation didn't stop at the water's edge. Perhaps their most enduring contribution to global civilization was the development of the first fully phonetic alphabet. Frustrated by the complex cuneiform and hieroglyphic systems used by their trading partners, Phoenician merchants streamlined writing into a set of just 22 symbols that represented consonant sounds. This wasn't an invention for poets or priests. It was a tool of commerce designed for speed, efficiency, and clarity in recording contracts and inventories. This revolutionary system was so practical that it was rapidly adopted and adapted by the Greeks and later the Romans, forming the very foundation of most Western alphabets used today. This highlights the true nature of their thalassocracy. Their influence wasn't just economic, it was profoundly cultural. They were the great synthesizers and disseminators of the ancient world. As they moved goods, they also moved ideas, technologies, art styles, and religious practices between Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, Greece, and beyond. They created a shared cultural language across the Mediterranean, a common ground built on commerce and connection. Their power was soft power centuries before the term was coined, a power built on mutual benefit, indispensability, and the sheer ability to get things where they needed to go. They ruled not by the sword, but by the sail and the ledger, proving that an empire could be built on contracts and trust just as effectively as on conquest and fear. While the Phoenicians were weaving their network across the Mediterranean, another thalassocracy was rising on the opposite side of the world, one whose power was so perfectly tied to a single, critical location that its very existence seems almost like a geographical inevitability. Imagine a bustling, vibrant empire with no need for grand palaces or sprawling farmlands, an empire whose heart was not a capital city but a narrow, churning stretch of water, the Strait of Malacca. This was the realm of Srivijaya, a maritime superpower that, from the 7th to the 13th centuries, mastered the art of controlling the world's most valuable shortcut. For any ship sailing between the great economic powerhouses of ancient Asia, China, India, and the Middle East, the Strait of Malacca was not merely a route, it was the route. To sail around the island of Sumatra would add thousands of treacherous miles to a journey, a risk no spice merchant would willingly take. This narrow passage became the indispensable throat of global trade, and the Srivijayan Empire positioned itself firmly as the gatekeeper. Their strategy was elegantly simple yet devastatingly effective. They controlled the pinch point, and thus they controlled the flow of all commerce. Every vessel laden with Chinese silk, Indian cotton, Arabian incense, or, most lucratively, the incredibly valuable spices of the Moluccas like cloves and nutmeg, had to sail through their waters. And for that privilege, Srivijaya demanded a toll. This system of taxation turned the empire into a titan of wealth without ever needing to mine for gold or conquer vast territories. They built a network of fortified port cities, most notably their capital at Palembang on the island of Sumatra, which functioned less as administrative centers and more as sophisticated, secure service stations for the world's merchants. Ships could find safe harbor, repair damage, resupply with fresh water and food, and have their goods protected, all for a price. This created a self-reinforcing cycle of prosperity. The safer and more efficient Srivijaya made the passage, the more traders used it, and the richer the empire became, allowing it to build a larger navy to protect the straits from pirates and rivals, which in turn attracted even more trade. But Srivijaya's influence extended far beyond mere economics. This constant flow of people and goods turned their ports into incredible melting pots of culture and religion. Recognizing the spiritual needs of the diverse merchants passing through, particularly the influential Buddhist traders from India, the Srivijayan rulers astutely adopted Mahayana Buddhism and became passionate patrons of Buddhist learning. They established monasteries and universities that attracted brilliant scholars from across Asia, like the famous Chinese monk Yijing, who stopped there for years to study Sanskrit before continuing his pilgrimage to India. In this way, Srivijaya became a revered spiritual and intellectual hub, a place where theology and commerce intertwined. Their power was projected not just by armed patrol ships ensuring taxes were paid, but also by the soft power of religious authority and cultural prestige, making them respected leaders rather than just feared toll collectors. The entire structure of their empire was a testament to the flexibility of thalassocratic rule. There was no need for a massive, centralized bureaucracy or a large standing army to hold inland territories. Their authority was decentralized, flowing from a powerful central ruler who commanded loyalty from a coalition of local chieftains and portmasters through a combination of shared profit and mutual protection. Their real army was their fleet, a navy of swift, agile ships that could police the Strait, respond to threats, and demonstrate their power anywhere along their liquid domain within days. For over 6 centuries, this model proved incredibly resilient, proving that an empire could be built not on owning land, but on mastering a moment, the moment every ship in the world had to decide between a safe, taxed passage or a long, dangerous journey around. Srivijaya made that decision very easy, and in doing so, built a lasting legacy on the waves. None of these floating empires could have existed without first solving the fundamental challenge of the sea itself. How do you turn a vast, trackless, and often violent expanse of water into a reliable highway? The answer lay not in magic, but in a relentless pursuit of technological innovation. The true foundation of thalassocratic power was hammered together in shipyards and etched into navigation charts, representing a revolution in how humans interacted with the ocean. It began with the very shape of the vessels. The Phoenicians, for instance, didn't just build boats, they engineered specialized tools for specific purposes. Their round-hulled merchant ships, known as goloi, were the cargo trucks of the ancient world. With their wide, deep bellies, they could carry staggering amounts of good cedar logs, stacks of amphorae filled with wine and oil and precious metals. They were powered primarily by a single large square sail, making them efficient for long hauls with favorable winds. But for speed, defense, and exploration, they developed the long, narrow galley. The bireme, with its 2 stacked banks of oarsmen, could move with terrifying speed and agility independent of the wind, perfect for chasing down pirates, rushing messages between ports, or conducting lightning raids. This philosophy of specialized design was echoed millennia later in Southeast Asia with the Srivijayan jong. These were massive sewn plank vessels, enormous for their time, capable of carrying hundreds of people and tons of cargo across the open Indian Ocean. The technique of sewing the hull planks together with cordage made from natural fibers like coir gave the ships a flexibility that allowed them to ride out massive ocean swells without cracking apart, a genius adaptation to their environment. But a sturdy ship is useless if you are lost. This is where advancements in navigation truly turned the sea from a barrier into a bridge. Ancient mariners were the first true global scientists, mastering celestial navigation long before the invention of the compass. They learned to read the stars not as myths but as a map. The Phoenicians, sailing by night, would have relied on the North Star, Polaris, which remains fixed in the northern sky, providing a constant reference point for latitude. Later, tools like the camel, used by Arab and likely Srivijayan navigators, brought precision to this art. This deceptively simple device was just a small, rectangular piece of wood with a string tied through its center. The navigator would hold the string in their teeth and move the card toward or away from their eye until the bottom edge seemed to touch the horizon and the top edge touched the North Star. The length of the string revealed their latitude, allowing them to sail along a consistent east-west line until they reached their destination. The astrolabe, a more complex bronze ring that measured the angle of the sun or stars above the horizon, served a similar purpose, though it was more suited for use on the stable deck of a ship in calm seas. Perhaps the most crucial navigational breakthrough, however, wasn't a tool at all, it was knowledge. It was the understanding of monsoon winds. In the Indian Ocean, the winds don't blow randomly. they reverse direction with metronomic regularity. For 6 months of the year, the wind blows steadily from the southwest, and for the other 6, it blows from the northeast. The traders of Srivijaya didn't fight these winds, they built their entire commercial calendar around them. A merchant could set sail from their port with the certainty that the wind would carry them directly to their destination, and then, after conducting their business for a season, the reversed winds would blow them right back home. This predictable rhythm made long-distance trade not a desperate gamble, but a scheduled, reliable enterprise. To support these voyages, Thalassocracies also invested in infrastructure we often take for granted. The Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, is the most famous example, but harbors across the Mediterranean and Southeast Asia would have employed smaller lighthouses, beacon fires, and carefully maintained channel markers to guide ships safely into port after their long journeys. They also developed early forms of piloting guides and sea charts, written descriptions of coastlines, landmarks, depths, and hazards, passed down orally and eventually in written form, effectively creating the first database of maritime knowledge. This combination of robust ships, precise tools, and profound environmental wisdom gave these floating empires the ability to project power, move wealth, and connect cultures across distances that would have been unimaginable to a land-bound kingdom. The sea was no longer a mystery, it was a mapped and mastered domain. Governing an empire that exists primarily as a network of sea lanes and distant ports is a challenge that would keep any modern administrator awake at night. Without the solid, contiguous land that defines a traditional empire, how do you maintain control, collect taxes, enforce laws, and ensure loyalty across thousands of miles of open ocean? The answer, perfected by Thalassocracies, was a radical departure from top-down rule. They traded the heavy hand of centralized bureaucracy for a light, flexible touch, a system of governance built on trust, mutual benefit, and incredibly efficient communication. The entire structure was less like a rigid pyramid and more like a vast, interconnected web. At the center was the homeland for the Phoenicians, the city-states of Tyre and Sidon, for Srivijaya, the capital at Palembang. But their true territory was the network itself, a constellation of trading posts, fortified ports, and allied communities scattered across the coasts. These weren't colonies designed for territorial expansion with large populations of settlers. They were commercial outposts, often little more than a sheltered cove, a warehouse, a dock, and a small garrison. Their sole purpose was to facilitate trade, serve as a resupply point, and most importantly, represent the empire's presence and authority in a far-flung region. To manage this dispersed domain, the Phoenicians developed a brilliantly personal system rooted in family and clan. Their distant trading posts were often administered by trusted members of powerful merchant families. A son or a cousin would be sent to oversee operations in a place like Carthage or Cadiz, creating a direct, blood-based line of loyalty back to the home city. This wasn't a faceless government official reporting to a distant capital. It was a family member managing the family business in a new market. This ensured that the interests of the outpost and the homeland were perfectly aligned. Profits flowed back through these familial channels, and decisions could be made quickly on the ground by someone with the authority and incentive to act in the best interest of the entire commercial network. It was governance through kinship and commerce, a model that proved incredibly resilient and adaptable. Srivijaya, meanwhile, mastered a different form of decentralized power. Its influence stretched across hundreds of islands and numerous ethnic groups, trying to impose a uniform, direct rule over such a vast and diverse archipelago would have been impossible. Instead, the empire's rulers exercised power through a system of strategic alliances and sophisticated soft power. Local chieftains and portmasters in surrounding areas were not conquered and replaced, they were co-opted. Srivijaya offered them a deal: acknowledge our supremacy, allow our navy to protect your waters from pirates, and in return, you get a share of the incredible wealth generated by the trade we channel through your port. This made loyalty a lucrative business decision. Furthermore, Srivijaya leveraged the immense spiritual authority of Buddhism. By positioning themselves as the protectors and patrons of major Buddhist monasteries and centers of learning, they gained the moral endorsement of a powerful religious institution. Local rulers who might chafe at paying tribute to a distant king were far less likely to rebel against a system that was also blessed by the monks and deities they revered. This blend of economic incentive and religious legitimacy created a powerful glue that held the empire together. The literal lifeblood of this entire administrative model was communication. In a land empire, a message could be sent by horse or runner along a paved road. In a thalassocracy, information traveled by the fastest ship available. Both empires maintained fleets of swift courier vessels, light, oar-powered galleys that could carry news, orders, and officials between ports with remarkable speed. A change in trade policy in Tyre could be communicated to Cadiz within a matter of weeks, not months. A threat from a rival power near the Malacca Strait could be reported to the capital almost as quickly as it emerged. This rapid flow of information allowed the central authority to respond to opportunities and crises with an agility that lumbering land-based empires could only dream of. The government was, in a very real sense, mobile, its authority sailing from node to node within its network, constantly reinforcing bonds and adjusting to new realities. This system was not without its critical weaknesses. This very flexibility and decentralization could become a vulnerability. If the flow of wealth slowed, or if a local ally found a better deal with a rival power, loyalty could evaporate overnight. The empire's strength was its network, but if a key node broke away, the entire web could begin to unravel. This delicate balance of power, maintained not by force but by shared interest and swift communication, stands as a stunningly modern and innovative chapter in the history of how humans have organized themselves to rule. The lifeblood of these floating empires, the very reason for their existence, pulsed not through fields of grain or mines of ore, but through the holds of ships and the ledgers of port masters. Their entire economic engine was fueled by a simple yet devastatingly effective principle: control the choke point, control the commerce. Imagine a bustling port in the Srivijayan capital of Palembang. A ship from Gujarat, heavy with Indian cotton and finely crafted pottery, waits for the monsoon winds to shift. Before it can continue its journey to the markets of China, a Srivijayan official boards the vessel. He doesn't come with an army to seize the cargo. He comes with a tablet and a tax assessment. For the privilege of safe passage through the empire's protected waters, for access to its secure harbors and fresh supplies, the merchant pays a tariff. This wasn't seen as piracy or extortion. It was a transaction for a vital service. That steady, predictable stream of tolls and tariffs, collected from thousands of ships every year, created a river of gold that flowed directly into the imperial coffers, funding everything from the navy that kept the seas safe to the grand Buddhist monasteries that projected soft power. But the genius of their economic model went far beyond simple toll collection. These empires were masters of what we would now call value-added trade. They didn't just move raw materials from point A to point B. They transformed them along the way, capturing the immense profit that comes from manufacturing. The Phoenicians are the classic example. Their homeland in the Levant was rich in one priceless resource: magnificent cedar trees. a lesser power might have simply exported the raw timber to Egypt or Mesopotamia. But the Phoenicians understood something profound. They built vast shipyards where that very timber was expertly crafted into the finest seafaring vessels of the age. They weren't selling logs, they were selling mobility, security, and dominance, and they charged a king's ransom for it. Similarly, they harvested the murex snail to produce a dye so vivid and color-fast that it became known as Tyrian purple. The process was notoriously foul-smelling and labor-intensive, requiring tens of thousands of snails to produce a single gram of dye. But by controlling this complex production from start to finish, they created a product so exclusive that for centuries, wearing a purple-dyed garment was the ultimate symbol of royalty and imperial status across the Mediterranean. They turned a common snail into one of the most valuable commodities in the ancient world. This economic system naturally fostered an environment ripe for innovation and sophisticated diplomacy. The need to build bigger, faster, and more seaworthy ships drove advancements in naval architecture. The necessity of navigating open water without landmarks spurred breakthroughs in astronomy and the development of tools like the camel. Furthermore, the sheer volume of trade required a standardized system of weights, measures, and eventually, currency to simplify transactions between cultures that didn't even speak the same language. This commercial reality also made thalassocracies inherently diplomatic. Their survival depended on maintaining good relations with both their suppliers and their customers. A Phoenician merchant in a foreign port wasn't a conqueror, he was a negotiator. He had to understand local customs, forge treaties that guaranteed favorable trading terms, and sometimes even offer his fleet as a mercenary navy to a land-based power in exchange for exclusive commercial access. Their power was leveraged through contracts and alliances as much as through naval strength. The wealth that sloshed back and forth across these water highways didn't just enrich a few kings, it built the first interconnected global economy, setting the stage for everything that was to come and proving that true power could be measured not in acres, but in the ability to control the current of commerce itself. Perhaps the most profound legacy of these floating empires lies not in the treasures they accumulated, but in the invisible cargo they carried between civilizations. While their ships were laden with spices, silks, and metals, they were also vessels for something far more enduring: ideas. The constant, rhythmic movement of people and goods across these maritime highways created an unprecedented opportunity for cultural and intellectual exchange, turning the entire network into a massive, open-air university where philosophies, technologies, and beliefs could cross-pollinate. These thalassocracies became the great synthesizers of the ancient world, proving that an empire's influence could be measured not just in gold, but in the spread of knowledge that would shape human history for millennia. The most stunning example of this is arguably the Phoenician alphabet. These pragmatic merchants grew frustrated with the incredibly complex writing systems of their time, like Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian cuneiform, which required years of study and were filled with hundreds of symbols. For a civilization built on speed and efficiency, this was a commercial bottleneck. Their brilliant solution was to develop a writing system based purely on sounds, a set of just 22 consonant symbols that could be easily learned and quickly written. This wasn't an invention for scribes or priests. It was a tool of commerce designed for drafting contracts, recording inventories, and labeling cargo on the bustling docks of Tyre and Sidon. But as Phoenician merchants established their trading posts across the Mediterranean, this incredibly practical system traveled with them. The Greeks, encountering this alphabet, recognized its genius and adapted it, crucially adding symbols for vowel sounds. This modified Greek alphabet was then passed to the Etruscans and later to the Romans, whose Latin script would become the foundation for most Western writing systems, including the one you are reading right now. A tool created to track shipments of olive oil and cedar would ultimately become the vehicle for recording everything from Homer's Odyssey to the laws of the Roman Republic, and eventually the vast corpus of human knowledge. This was the unintended, world-changing consequence of maritime trade. On the other side of the world, Srivijaya played a similarly transformative role, not with an alphabet but with a religion. By controlling the vital Strait of Malacca, the empire positioned itself at the crossroads of spiritual as well as commercial traffic. Recognizing that many of the wealthy Indian merchants sailing through their waters were devout Buddhists, the shrewd Srivijayan rulers became passionate patrons of Mahayana Buddhism. They didn't just tolerate the religion, they actively invested in it, building magnificent monasteries and funding centers of learning that attracted the greatest theological minds of the era. The most famous of these scholars was the Chinese monk Yijing, who spent years in Palembang studying Sanskrit and Buddhist texts before continuing his pilgrimage to India. When he and others like him returned home, they carried with them not just sacred texts, but a refined and deeply studied interpretation of Buddhist philosophy that had been honed and debated in Srivijaya's intellectual hubs. The empire effectively became a crucial filtering and amplification point for Buddhist thought, ensuring its sophisticated transmission into East Asia and cementing its place as a major world religion. Their ports became spiritual way stations where faith was both a commodity and a currency of soft power. This cultural diffusion extended far beyond writing and religion. Through these maritime networks, architectural techniques sailed from one port to another, influencing temple designs and urban layouts across continents. Culinary traditions were swapped in harbor market spices from the Malacca's transforming cuisines in the Middle East, while new cooking methods traveled back the other way. Perhaps most importantly, scientific and technological knowledge found new audiences. Concepts of mathematics and astronomy, vital for navigation, were shared and improved upon by sailors from different cultures meeting in foreign ports. Medical knowledge about herbs and treatments discovered in one part of the world could, within a few sailing seasons, be saving lives in another. This constant, informal exchange of practical wisdom accelerated innovation in a way that was impossible for isolated, landlocked kingdoms. The floating empires, by their very nature, created a world that was far more interconnected and intellectually dynamic than we often assume, building a foundation of shared human knowledge upon which our modern world still stands. For an empire whose wealth and power flowed exclusively across the surface of the sea, the ability to protect those liquid arteries was not just a matter of security, it was a matter of existential survival. A single successful raid on a wealthy merchant convoy or the loss of a key port could shatter the confidence of the entire trading network, causing merchants to seek safer, if longer, routes. This constant threat demanded a multi-layered defense strategy that blended sheer military might with psychological deterrence and shrewd diplomacy. The Thalassocracies became pioneers of naval warfare, developing tools and tactics specifically designed to dominate the waterways and project an image of invincibility to any who might challenge their authority. The first line of defense was, of course, the warship itself, but these were not merely armed versions of trade vessels. They were highly specialized instruments of power, engineered for specific combat roles. The Phoenician war galley, or bireme, was a masterpiece of ancient naval engineering. Its long, narrow, and incredibly lightweight hull was designed for one thing above all else: speed and acceleration. The key to its offensive power was the bronze-sheathed ram that protruded from the prow just at the waterline. This was not a blunt instrument for smashing, it was a precision weapon. The tactic was to row at maximum speed, using the bank of oarsmen for unmatched maneuverability, and to drive this hardened bronze beak directly into the side of an enemy vessel. The goal was to punch a fatal hole below the waterline, causing the ship to flood and sink rapidly, all while allowing the attacking galley to reverse oars and disengage to attack another target. This turned naval combat into a battle of skill and seamanship rather than just brute force, a terrifying prospect for any pirate in a slower, less agile boat. Srivijaya, facing different challenges in the open waters of the Indian Ocean, adapted its approach. Their vast, multi-masted merchant ships, the Jongs, were themselves formidable vessels. While they carried goods, they were also heavily armed with archers and fighters. This created a form of constant, mobile defense. A convoy of these ships was not a vulnerable target but a floating fortress. Furthermore, they maintained fleets of faster, smaller patrol craft, likely similar to the later galley ships used in the region. These swift vessels could respond to distress signals, hunt down pirates lurking in the countless small islands of the archipelago, and constantly police the busy sea lanes of the Strait of Malacca, ensuring that the empire's authority was always visible. Beyond the ships themselves, these empires built a physical infrastructure of control along their coastlines. Lookout towers were constructed on strategic headlands and high points on islands, staffed by watchmen who could spot incoming ships from miles away. The sight of a suspicious sail could trigger a chain of signals, perhaps smoke by day or fire beacons by night, that would race down the coast far faster than any ship could sail, alerting the nearest naval squadron. Ports were not just commercial hubs, they were heavily fortified strongholds. Massive stone walls protected the inner harbors, and chains could be stretched across harbor mouths to prevent unauthorized entry. These fortified ports served as secure bases where the Navy could resupply, repair, and wait, safe from storms and enemies, ready to project power anywhere along the coast at a moment's notice. Perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of their defense, however, was the use of non-military tools. Thalassocracies were masterful diplomats. They understood that sometimes the most cost-effective way to eliminate a threat was to turn a potential enemy into an ally. They would often form treaties with smaller coastal chiefdoms, offering them protection from other rivals and favorable trading rights in exchange for their loyalty and assistance in policing the waters. This extended the empire's eyes and ears without requiring a permanent military presence everywhere. They also used their economic power as a weapon. A port city or trading community that harbored pirates or interfered with trade could find itself suddenly cut off from the entire network, facing economic ruin without a single arrow being fired. This complex, layered strategy, combining cutting-edge warships, a network of fortifications, and clever diplomacy, created a secure environment where commerce could flourish, proving that the most powerful empire was not necessarily the one that won every battle, but the one that could convince everyone it was too dangerous to fight. Living in a world dominated by vast land empires with massive armies presented a constant strategic puzzle for the Thalassocracies. Their survival depended on a delicate and often dangerous dance of diplomacy, knowing that a wrong move could bring the full force of a terrestrial superpower crashing down upon their vulnerable port cities. For the floating empires, the relationship with their land-based neighbors was never one of simple isolation or outright conquest. It was a nuanced game of mutual need and wary respect, where the sea itself was both their greatest strength and their most exposed flank. The Phoenicians became absolute masters of this diplomatic art. They understood that their incredible naval power was a valuable commodity that could be rented out to the highest bidder, and they used this to their immense advantage. When the mighty Assyrian Empire began its expansion, it possessed a formidable army but lacked a serious navy. The kings of Tyre and Sidon saw an opportunity. They offered their fleets to the Assyrians as naval auxiliaries, providing the sea power needed to project force along the Mediterranean coast and enforce blockades. In return, the Assyrians and later the Persians granted the Phoenician city-states a remarkable degree of autonomy. They were not fully conquered and absorbed. They became vassals in name but partners in practice. They continued to manage their own affairs and, most importantly, their incredibly profitable trade networks, as long as they paid tribute and provided their ships when called upon. This arrangement was a brilliant strategy. The land empire got the naval muscle it desperately needed without having to build it from scratch, and the Thalassocracy bought itself protection, legitimacy, and continued freedom to conduct business. It was a symbiotic relationship built on a clear exchange of specialized services. However, this balance was perpetually fragile. The same naval power that made them valuable allies could also make them appear as threatening rivals. If a thalassocracy grew too wealthy or its control of trade became too overt, it could trigger a violent response from a land power seeking to capture that wealth for itself. The very independence that the Phoenicians prized could be seen as arrogance or rebellion by an overlord with a different concept of authority. History shows this tension repeatedly boiling over. The great city of Tyre, though it had cooperated with empires for centuries, famously faced a brutal and prolonged siege by Alexander the Great, who was determined to break its naval power and symbolic defiance. The city's island location made it a formidable fortress, but Alexander's relentless ingenuity and resources eventually prevailed, a stark reminder that even the most secure maritime stronghold could fall to a determined land power. On the other side of the world, Srivijaya faced a different kind of challenge from a terrestrial giant, not a neighboring army, but the distant economic behemoth of China. The Song dynasty was a period of immense commercial growth and maritime activity for China, with its merchants increasingly traveling the sea routes to Southeast Asia and beyond. Srivijaya's stranglehold on the Strait of Malacca and the taxes it levied on all passing trade began to be seen in the Chinese court not as a service fee for safe passage, but as an unfair barrier to their own commercial ambitions. Tensions simmered for decades. Chinese records from the time occasionally complain of Srivijayan piracy or interference, which was likely their way of describing the empire's assertive enforcement of its tariffs. At other times, Srivijaya sent lavish diplomatic missions to the Song capital, bearing gifts of exotic spices and rare animals, in an effort to smooth over relations and reaffirm their status as the indispensable gatekeepers of the Western trade. This push and pull dynamic between Srivijaya's need to control the Strait and China's desire for unfettered access showcases how the economic power of a thalassocracy could directly clash with the strategic interests of a continental empire. It was a Cold War fought with tariffs, diplomacy, and occasional naval posturing rather than open battle. These complex interactions reveal the fundamental truth about floating empires. Their power was always contextual and relational. It existed in the space between the interests of larger, land-based entities. They thrived by making themselves simultaneously useful and non-threatening, by providing a service that was too valuable to lose but too dangerous to try and seize completely. Their genius lay in knowing when to offer their hand in alliance and when to flex their naval muscle in warning, constantly calibrating their position to ensure that the benefits of cooperation always, for their powerful neighbors, outweighed the costs of conflict. Beyond the clatter of the dockyards and the complex ledgers of trade, the true glue that held these far-flung maritime networks together often flowed from a deeper, more spiritual source. For empires without contiguous land, a shared faith or a unifying ideology wasn't just a matter of personal belief. It was a vital tool of statecraft, a way to build loyalty across vast distances and diverse cultures. The rulers of Thalassocracies were quick to understand that to command the waves, they needed the perceived blessing of the gods who ruled them. This led to the creation of what we might call a divine mandate of the sea, a powerful fusion of spiritual authority and political power that resonated in every port from the Mediterranean to the Strait of Malacca. The Phoenicians, for instance, wove their commercial ambitions directly into their religious practices. Their chief deity in the city of Tyre was Melkart, whose name literally translates to king of the city. But he was far more than a local guardian. Melkart was a god of colonization, of maritime venture, and of the cyclical rhythm of death and rebirth that every sailor faced when embarking on a long, dangerous voyage. The Phoenicians believed that their success in founding new trading posts and navigating treacherous waters was a direct result of Melkart's favor. Their rulers were not just kings, they were the chief priests of this cult, the vital intermediaries between the people and the god who guaranteed their prosperity on the open ocean. This gave their imperial project a sacred dimension. A merchant setting sail from Carthage to trade for tin wasn't just on a business trip, he was participating in a divinely sanctioned endeavor, his safety entrusted to the patron deity of the entire Phoenician enterprise. This shared faith created an invisible bond of identity between a sailor from Tyre and a dockmaster in Cadiz, making them part of the same spiritual community even if they had never met. On the other side of the world, Srivijaya employed a different but equally potent religious strategy. As the great hub of Buddhist trade between India and China, the empire's rulers astutely embraced Mahayana Buddhism and positioned themselves as its most generous and devout patrons. They did not merely build temples, they established world-renowned centers of Buddhist learning, like the great monastery and university at Palembang, which attracted scholars, monks, and pilgrims from across Asia. The Srivijayan king was not just a political leader, he was a Chakravartin, a universal monarch who ruled in accordance with Buddhist law, a righteous ruler whose power was legitimized by his protection of the faith and his support for the monastic community. This was a masterstroke of soft power. A Chinese merchant arriving in a Srivijayan port would find not just a foreign land, but a familiar spiritual landscape. The sight of grand stupas, the sound of chanting in Sanskrit, and the presence of revered monks made the empire feel less like a hostile taxing authority and more like a benevolent, civilized partner in a shared spiritual journey. The king's authority was thus sanctified, his tariffs subtly reframed not as mere extraction, but as a contribution to the maintenance of a sacred space that benefited all who passed through. The role of religious institutions extended far beyond ceremony and into the gritty reality of daily commerce. Temples and monasteries often functioned as the first banks and notaries of the ancient world. In Srivijaya, a large monastery located near the docks would have been a natural place for a traveling merchant to deposit a portion of his wealth for safekeeping before a risky journey, or to have a commercial contract witnessed and recorded by literate, respected monks who were seen as neutral and trustworthy. In Phoenician ports, temples to Melkart likely served a similar function, storing goods, recording transactions on clay tablets, and mediating disputes according to religious law. This practical involvement gave the religious establishment a direct stake in the economic stability and success of the empire, further blurring the line between the spiritual and the commercial. The divine mandate on the high seas was therefore a complete system. It provided a shared identity for a dispersed people, legitimized the ruler's authority, offered practical services that greased the wheels of commerce, and presented the entire Thalassocratic project as a righteous, God-approved order. It was the soul of the network, ensuring that loyalty was about more than just profit. It was about belonging to something greater. Life on the water highways was a study in constant motion and cultural fusion, a world where identity was forged not by the soil one tilled, but by the horizons one sailed toward. The heartbeat of these empires was the port city, a place like no other in the ancient world. Walking through a Srivijayan harbor like Palembang or a Phoenician outpost like Carthage, you would be immersed in a sensory overload of globalization. The air itself was a complex perfume of salt spray, exotic spices, sandalwood and cinnamon from the east, fragrant resins like frankincense from Arabia, and the ever-present scent of tar and timber from the bustling shipyards. The sounds were a symphony of chaos and commerce, the shouted orders of dockworkers in a dozen different languages, the rhythmic hammering from caulkers repairing hulls, the bartering of merchants haggling over bolts of Chinese silk or jars of Greek olive oil. You would see Tamil merchants from India in distinctive cotton dhotis, Arab traders with intricate astrolabes, and perhaps even emissaries from the Tang dynasty in their elegant silken robes, all rubbing shoulders in a market that felt like the very center of the world. These were the original melting pots where a sailor could share a meal of salted fish and rice, hear a Buddhist parable one night and a Phoenician creation myth the next, and where children grew up multilingual, absorbing words and customs from every corner of the known world. Aboard the ships that made this world possible, life was one of extreme skill, grueling labor, and profound camaraderie. A merchant vessel was not just a means of transport, it was a tightly knit, floating community where every man's life depended on the competence of the others. The crew was a hierarchy of expertise. At the top was the captain, or nakhoda in the Malay world, a figure who commanded absolute authority. He was not just a navigator but a master diplomat, a shrewd businessman, and a skilled meteorologist who could read the subtle signs of the wind and waves. Beneath him were the specialized crew, the pilot who possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of coastlines, currents, and hidden reefs, the shipwright who carried out emergency repairs at sea with nothing but simple tools and raw timber, and the common sailors who manned the sails and oars. Their days were filled with back-breaking work, hoisting heavy linen sails, bailing water from the bilge, endlessly maintaining ropes and rigging. They slept on deck under animal hides, their diet a monotonous but vital routine of hardtack, dried fish, pulses, and a ration of watered wine or palm wine to ward off scurvy. Despite the hardship, these men possessed a knowledge that was priceless. The ability to tie 100 different knots, to navigate by the stars using only their naked eye and a simple camel, and to sense a coming storm hours before it appeared on the horizon. They were the unsung engineers of the floating empire, the human machinery that powered the entire system. Back on land, the social structure of these maritime societies turned traditional hierarchies upside down. In a land-based kingdom, status was determined by how much acreage you owned or how noble your bloodline was. In a thalassocracy, prestige was measured by the weight of your purse and the reach of your trade networks. A successful shipowner from Tyre, even if he came from a common family, could amass wealth that rivaled a land-bound aristocrat and wield tremendous influence in the city's councils. Artisans who produced goods for export, the glassblowers, the dyers, the metalworkers formed a powerful and respected middle class. This social mobility, however limited by modern standards, was far more fluid than in contemporary agricultural societies. Your worth was not predetermined by birth but could be earned through skill, courage, and commercial acumen. This created a society that valued pragmatism, innovation, and adaptability above all else. Yet this vibrant way of life was perpetually shadowed by risk and uncertainty. Every time a ship left the safety of the harbor, it embarked on a journey where disaster was a constant possibility. A sudden squall could snap a mast and send a vessel and its priceless cargo to the bottom of the sea in minutes. Navigational errors could strand a ship on a desolate, uncharted coast. The threat of piracy was ever present, with fast, agile raiders lurking in the countless islands of the Mediterranean or the Indonesian archipelago, ready to plunder a wealthy merchantman. An economic downturn, a shift in trade winds, or the rise of a rival port could bankrupt a once prosperous merchant family overnight. This environment of high risk and high reward forged a unique cultural character, one that was resilient, resourceful, and deeply superstitious. Sailors developed elaborate rituals to appease the gods of the sea, carried protective amulets, and clung to omens and taboos, all in an effort to impose a sense of control on the unpredictable power of the ocean they depended upon. The success of a floating empire was never guaranteed by ambition alone. It was a delicate dance with the very forces of nature, a partnership forged with geography itself. These civilizations didn't just happen to be near water. They were meticulously sculpted by their environment, their fortunes rising and falling with the tides, the winds, and the lay of the land. The map wasn't just a territory to be claimed, it was a script to be read, and the greatest Thalassocracies were those who could decipher its clues and write their destiny upon the waves. Their story is a powerful testament to how human ingenuity can leverage natural advantage, but also a humbling reminder that nature always has the final say. Consider the sheer strategic brilliance of a location like the Strait of Malacca. For the Srivijaya Empire, this wasn't just a strip of water, it was the ultimate geographical lottery win. This narrow passage between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula is the shortest and most efficient sea route connecting the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea. For any vessel sailing between the economic powerhouses of China and India, bypassing it meant adding months to a journey, navigating the treacherous and pirate-infested waters south of Sumatra or through the Sunda Strait. By establishing their power base here, Srivijaya positioned itself as the sole toll collector on the world's most vital commercial highway. They turned a geographical inevitability, the need for all east-west trade to funnel through this pinch point into an unshakable economic foundation. They didn't need to conquer the entire archipelago, they just needed to control the door. Conversely, the Phoenician story begins with a different kind of geographical gift, a spectacularly rugged and resource-rich coastline. Their homeland in the Levant was a narrow strip of land bounded by mountains and sea, offering little room for agricultural expansion. But what it lacked in farmland, it made up for in magnificent, deep water harbors, natural bays protected by rocky headlands that provided safe anchorage for their ships away from the Mediterranean's unpredictable storms. These harbors were natural fortresses and perfect launch pads for maritime enterprise. More importantly, the mountains rising behind these ports were dense with magnificent cedar forests. This wasn't just lumber, it was the raw material of empire. The Phoenicians' most valuable export, their unparalleled ships, were built from the very resource their unique geography provided. Their entire economy was built from the cedar tree, from the hulls of their ships to the timbers traded with land empires desperate for quality construction materials. Their environment dictated their specialty, yet for all the advantages, the natural world also presented a constant, terrifying array of challenges that could undo centuries of progress in a single day. The same monsoon winds that reliably blew traders to and from Srivijaya's ports could also transform into devastating typhoons, capable of shredding sails, snapping masts, and sending entire fleets to the bottom of the ocean. The coral reefs that grew in the warm tropical waters, while beautiful, were hidden menaces lying in wait for any captain who strayed even slightly off course, capable of tearing the heart out of a ship's hull. In the Mediterranean, shifting sandbars could silently block harbor entrances that had been navigable for generations, strangling a port's economic lifeblood until a costly and complex dredging operation could be undertaken. These were not occasional inconveniences, they were ever-present risks that every sailor and merchant calculated with every voyage. The ledger of profitability always had to account for the potential of total loss from a force beyond human control. This intimate dance with nature extended to the most basic human needs. The location of every single trading post, every colony, was dictated by a ruthless geographical logic. A potential site might have a perfect, sheltered cove, but if it lacked a reliable source of fresh water, it was useless. Long voyages required constant resupply of drinking water, and empires had to establish their outposts at oases along the coast, places with accessible springs or rivers. The availability of food was equally critical. A port needed to be able to feed not only its permanent population, but also the hundreds of sailors who might arrive on a fleet of ships, all needing to reprovision before the next leg of their journey. This is why fertile coastal plains near river deltas were so prized. They could produce the surplus food required to fuel the maritime machine. Ultimately, the reach of a thalassocracy was limited by the range of its ships and the spacing of these vital resupply points. An empire could only expand as far as the next safe harbor with fresh water and food, making the geography of coastlines the ultimate architect of imperial borders. The story of these floating empires is therefore a story of brilliant adaptation. They listened to the whispers of the wind and the secrets of the currents, and in doing so, they learned to make the immense, powerful sea their home. Even the most brilliant and resilient empires are not immune to the relentless tides of change, and for the great Thalassocracies, their very strengths contained the seeds of their eventual vulnerabilities. The decline of these floating powers was rarely a single, dramatic event, but rather a slow erosion, a perfect storm of internal fragilities and external shifts that gradually pulled them beneath the waves of history. Their network-based power, so agile and efficient, proved to be surprisingly fragile when key nodes in the system began to fail. One of the most insidious and literal threats was the silting of their vital ports. The very harbors that had once welcomed the world's ships could slowly choke on the sediment washed down from rivers, transforming deep water anchorages into shallow, unusable lagoons. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a death sentence for a port city. As ships grew larger to carry more cargo, they required ever deeper drafts. A port that could no longer accommodate them was simply bypassed, its economic lifeblood cut off. This geological process, slow and unstoppable, rendered some of the most strategic locations obsolete, stranding communities that had thrived for centuries and forcing trade to find new pathways. Beyond these environmental challenges, the world around them was constantly shifting, creating new competitors and new routes that bypassed their carefully controlled choke points. The rise of the Javanese Majapahit Empire in the 13th and 14th centuries presented a direct and formidable challenge to Srivijaya's hegemony. As a powerful land-based empire with its own ambitious maritime agenda, Majapahit began to project power outward, contesting control over the spice trade and offering alternative alliances to port cities that had once been loyal to Srivijaya. This was compounded by a profound cultural and political shift, the gradual spread of Islam through maritime trade networks. New Islamic sultanates began to emerge in the region, such as Malacca, which offered a different model of governance and trade, one that was deeply appealing to many merchants and local rulers. These sultanates often built their power on the same thalassocratic principles, but they were newer, more dynamic, and unburdened by the entrenched systems of the old empire. Srivijaya, once the indispensable middleman, found itself squeezed between a terrestrial military power and a vibrant new commercial and religious rival, its economic rationale slowly dissolving. A similar story of absorption played out in the Mediterranean for the Phoenician heartland. While their colony of Carthage would famously clash with Rome in the Punic Wars, the original Phoenician cities like Tyre and Sidon faced a different fate. Their immense value as naval assets and commercial hubs made them irresistible prizes for the expanding land-based empires of the region, first the Persians, then Alexander the Great, and finally the Romans. These conquerors did not necessarily seek to destroy the Phoenician trading system. In many cases, they wanted to harness it for their own purposes. However, this incorporation came at the cost of independence. The innovative spirit and entrepreneurial drive that had built the network were slowly subsumed into the vast, bureaucratic machinery of a terrestrial empire. The Phoenicians became subjects, their famed ships now part of a Roman navy, their unique cultural identity gradually fading into the broader Greco-Roman world. Their power was not defeated so much as it was nationalized and stripped of its original creative spark. The consequences of these declines rippled far beyond the fall of a capital city or a change in ruler. The collapse of a major thalassocracy could trigger waves of economic dislocation across entire regions. The sophisticated financial systems, the standardized weights and measures, the safe passage guarantees, all the infrastructure of trust that had facilitated long-distance trade could evaporate almost overnight. This would lead to a contraction of trade routes, a rise in piracy, and a return to more localized, insular economies. Culturally, the vibrant cosmopolitanism of the port cities often fragmented as the constant flow of people and ideas slowed to a trickle. The great melting pots cooled, and distinct local identities reasserted themselves. Yet, to say these empires simply vanished would be a profound mistake. Their legacy was too deeply woven into the fabric of the world to be entirely erased. Diasporic communities of Phoenician and Srivijayan merchants often persisted in foreign ports for generations, maintaining their traditions and commercial networks on a smaller scale. The Phoenician alphabet had already taken root and spread, evolving into the foundational scripts of the Western world. The navigational knowledge painstakingly gathered by centuries of sailors, the star charts, the understanding of monsoon patterns, the coastal piloting guides, was passed down, becoming part of the shared inheritance of all subsequent mariners. The downfall of these floating empires offers a crucial lesson in the vulnerabilities of a network. When your power is derived from connection and flow, any disruption to that flow, whether a silted harbor, a new competitor, or a conquering army, can be catastrophic. Their history reminds us that resilience often requires not just strength, but also the ability to adapt to a world that will not stop changing. For centuries, the stories of these floating empires were just that, stories, whispered down through ancient texts and half-remembered legends. How could we ever truly know the scale of their trade, the design of their ships, or the daily lives of their sailors? The answer, quite literally, lay beneath the waves. The field of underwater archaeology has completely revolutionized our understanding, pulling these thalassocracies from the realm of myth and into the sharp, tangible focus of history. It's one thing to read an ancient account of a trade route. It's another to hold a 3,000-year-old jar that once sailed upon it. These sunken secrets, preserved in the cold, dark, oxygen-poor depths of the sea, are time capsules offering us an unvarnished, breathtakingly personal window into the past. One of the most spectacular of these windows is the Uluburun shipwreck, discovered off the coast of Turkey. This wasn't just an old boat, it was a snapshot of the entire late Bronze Age global economy, frozen in time on the seabed. The ship itself was a Canaanite vessel, a precursor to the classic Phoenician traders, and its cargo was a mind-boggling treasure trove. There were 10 tons of copper ingots, shaped like ox hides, alongside a ton of tin, the precise ratio needed to create bronze. There was ebony wood from Africa, ivory tusks, and hippopotamus teeth. There were jars filled with glass beads, ostrich eggs, and terebinth resin, likely used for incense. There was gold jewelry, a stone scepter, and a scarab bearing the name of the Egyptian queen Nefertiti. This single shipwreck tells us more about the complexity and reach of pre-Phoenician maritime trade than 1,000 clay tablets. It shows us that these networks were not just local, they were vast, interconnecting empires from Egypt to Mesopotamia to the Aegean in a sophisticated web of exchange long before the classical era. On the other side of the world, in the murky waters and dense jungles of Sumatra, archaeologists have been piecing together the puzzle of Srivijaya. For a long time, this empire was known primarily from brief mentions in Chinese and Arab texts, a powerful but elusive kingdom. Then, excavations began around the Musi River near Palembang. Instead of finding grand stone palaces, they uncovered something far more telling: the remains of extensive stilt villages, ancient docks, and countless artifacts that had eroded from the riverbanks. Fishermen trawling the river have accidentally hauled up a king's ransom in history: intricate gold jewelry, ritual Buddhist rings, exquisite Chinese ceramics from the Tang and Song dynasties, and thousands of gold beads. Most crucially, they discovered stone inscriptions known as the Kota Kapur and Karang Brahai inscriptions. These weren't just random carvings, they were official proclamations. They spoke of military expeditions, of curses upon those who disobeyed the king's law, and of the empire's dominion over the surrounding areas. This physical evidence confirmed that Palembang was indeed the heart of a major maritime power, a place of immense wealth and centralized authority, just as the ancient texts had suggested. The tools of this discovery have evolved from simple dredges to something out of science fiction. Modern marine archaeologists no longer rely solely on lucky finds by divers. They now use side-scan sonar to map the seafloor with incredible detail, revealing the subtle contours of a buried wreck without disturbing a single grain of sand. They deploy remote-operated vehicles, or ROVs, equipped with high-definition cameras and delicate robotic arms to explore depths that are too dangerous for human divers, sending back crystal-clear images from the abyss. In the lab, the science is even more astounding. Researchers can now conduct DNA analysis on the residues inside ancient amphorae to determine whether they held wine, olive oil, or dates. They can analyze the isotopic signatures of lead ingots to trace them back to the specific mine they came from, mapping trade routes with pinpoint accuracy. This technology is allowing us to move beyond simply listing what was on a ship. It lets us reconstruct entire economic systems, understand the diets of sailors, and trace the incredible journeys of individual artifacts from their origin to their final, watery grave. Perhaps the most exciting aspect of these discoveries is their power to completely overturn our assumptions. For generations, historians might have viewed these thalassocracies as loose confederations of traders or regional powers. The evidence from the sea tells a different story, one of astonishing sophistication, planning, and scale. The sheer volume and diversity of goods on a wreck like Uluburun point to a highly organized commercial operation, not casual tramp trading. The geographical spread of Srivijayan artifacts proves their influence was not a myth but a tangible economic reality that stretched for thousands of miles. Every time a new wreck is found or a new inscription is read, we are forced to redraw our mental maps of the ancient world, making it larger, more connected, and far more ingenious than we ever imagined. The silent, broken hulls on the ocean floor are finally telling their stories, and they are stories of epic ambition. But beyond the cold, hard evidence of trade goods and sunken ships, the legacy of these floating empires lives on in something far more ethereal and captivating: the world of myth and legend. For sailors spending weeks out of sight of land, with only the stars and the endless horizon for company, the sea was a place of profound mystery and danger. It's no wonder that their stories are filled with fantastical creatures, enchanted islands, and gods who walked the waves. Yet, these weren't just idle tales told for entertainment around a flickering lamp. They were a vital part of the maritime world, serving as navigational aids, moral compasses, and powerful tools of political persuasion. Consider the Phoenician tales of their god Melkart, whose name means king of the city. His myths are a direct reflection of their thalassocratic ambitions. He wasn't just a deity confined to a temple in Tyre. He was a god of colonization and maritime exploration. The legends told of his heroic voyages beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, into the terrifying and unknown Atlantic Ocean. These stories did more than just glorify a god. They served as a divine blueprint and justification for Phoenician expansion. If Melkart could venture into these fearsome waters and establish new realms, then so too could his people under his sacred protection. Every new trading post founded on a distant shore was, in a way, a reenactment of his myth, a literal fulfillment of a divine mandate that turned commercial outposts into holy sites and business ventures into acts of piety. Similarly, in the Srivijayan world, the line between king and god was often beautifully blurred. Legends spoke of rulers who possessed magical powers, who could command the waves and the winds, and who held court not in stationary palaces of stone, but in magnificent, floating palaces that could travel between islands. This wasn't mere fantasy, it was sophisticated political ideology. In an empire with no fixed geographical center, where power was fluid and based on control of moving trade routes, what better symbol of authority than a king who ruled from a palace that itself was in motion? These stories reinforced the idea that the Srivijayan ruler's power was not tied to any one patch of land, but was as vast and encompassing as the ocean itself. They presented him as a Chakravartin, a universal monarch whose legitimacy came from the spiritual world, helping to secure the loyalty of diverse and far-flung subjects who might never lay eyes on him. Perhaps the most practical function of these seafaring myths was as encrypted navigational manuals. In an age before detailed charts, vital knowledge about safe routes and deadly hazards had to be memorized and passed down through generations. What better way to remember that a particular island had a dangerous ring of submerged rocks than through a chilling story about a kraken or a sea serpent that made its home there, waiting to devour unwary sailors? A tale about an enchanted, vanishing island that could only be found under a certain phase of the moon might actually be a poetic way of describing a low-lying atoll that only appears above water at low tide. These stories made critical information unforgettable. A young sailor would remember the thrilling legend of the monster, and in doing so, he would remember to steer wide of that treacherous reef. The myths of sirens whose beautiful songs lured men to their doom on rocky shores could be a stark warning against the very real danger of following an unfamiliar coastline too closely in poor visibility. The fiction preserved the fact, ensuring that hard-won knowledge survived for centuries. This rich tapestry of storytelling didn't just stay within the confines of these empires. It flowed out along their trade routes and seeped into the literary traditions of the world. The wandering, sea-based adventures of the Phoenician Melkart find clear echoes in the Greek hero Heracles, and later in the epic voyages of Homer's Odysseus, a hero constantly tested by the capricious gods of the sea. In Southeast Asia, the Srivijayan-inspired tales of divine kings and magical journeys became woven into the region's great epics, like the Sejarah Melayu, the Malay Annals, which are filled with stories of royal authority derived from the ocean and miraculous voyages that establish kingdoms. By separating the likely fact from the deliberate fiction in these narratives, we don't diminish them. We actually understand the ancient mariners' world more deeply. We see how they used stories to explain the unexplainable, to control the uncontrollable, and to build a shared identity that could stretch across the terrifying and wonderful emptiness of the sea. While the Phoenicians and Srivijaya perfected the art of thalassocracy in the ancient world, they were far from the last to build an empire upon the waves. If we leap forward in time, we find fascinating echoes of their strategies in later maritime powers, proving that the core principles of sea-based rule are timeless, even as the specific models adapt to new technologies and political landscapes. Consider the Venetian Republic, a medieval and Renaissance powerhouse that, like its ancient predecessors, was built on a precarious foundation of lagoons and marshes. With almost no arable land, Venice's survival depended entirely on its mastery of the Mediterranean Sea. Its merchants established a network of trading posts that stretched from the Adriatic to the Black Sea and the Levant, mirroring the Phoenician colony system. They controlled the flow of luxury goods, spices, silks, and gems between Asia and Europe, becoming fabulously wealthy by acting as the indispensable middleman. Yet their governance was a unique variation. Unlike the dynastic or theocratic rulers of Srivijaya, Venice was an oligarchic republic ruled by a council of wealthy merchant families and an elected doge. Their power was maintained through a combination of naval might, ruthless commercial diplomacy, and a sophisticated system of espionage. The Venetian arsenal, a massive, state-controlled shipyard that could produce a fully equipped warship in a single day, was a technological marvel that would have been the envy of any ancient thalassocracy, representing a new industrial scale of naval innovation. Then there's the Hanseatic League, an entirely different beast that emerged in northern Europe. This wasn't a single state or a traditional empire at all, but a confederation of hundreds of independent merchant guilds and free cities, from Lubeck to Riga to Bruges. United not by a flag or a king, but by a shared commercial interest, the Hansa dominated trade in the Baltic and North Seas from the 13th to the 17th centuries. Their power was economic and legal, enforced by a shared fleet that could blockade the ports of any prince or kingdom that threatened their trading privileges. They established contours, their version of fortified trading posts, in distant cities like London and Novgorod, creating a commercial network that operated outside the feudal system of land-based loyalty. The Hanseatic League demonstrates that the thalassocratic model could be decentralized and cooperative, a network of equals bound by contract and mutual profit rather than a centralized authority. Even the British Empire, often thought of as the ultimate land-based colonial power, owed its initial rise and sustained dominance to a profoundly thalassocratic strategy. Its famous wooden walls, the ships of the Royal Navy, were the guardians of a global system often called the Pax Britannica. The British focused on acquiring and fortifying strategic naval bases and coaling stations Gibraltar, Malta, Aden, Singapore, Hong Kong, which functioned exactly like the ancient choke points controlled by Srivijaya. These bases ensured that British trade routes, particularly the vital sea lane to India, remained secure. The empire's economic philosophy of mercantilism, while more rigid than the freewheeling trade of the Phoenicians, was still fundamentally about controlling and profiting from the flow of goods across the oceans. The scale was unprecedented, enabled by industrial-era technology, but the underlying blueprint prioritized naval dominance, control key maritime junctions, and build wealth through global trade was remarkably familiar. Placing these diverse powers side by side reveals a stunning continuity in strategy across millennia. Whether in the Mediterranean of 1000 BCE or the global oceans of the 19th century, successful Thalassocracies all understood the supreme importance of controlling critical choke points, from the Strait of Malacca to the Strait of Gibraltar to the Suez Canal. Each was driven to invest heavily in naval innovation, from the Phoenician bireme to the Venetian great galley to the British steam-powered ironclad, because their survival depended on ruling the waves. And without exception, their primary objective was always commercial, the accumulation of wealth through the control of trade routes, not the territorial conquest of inland empires. Yet, their differences are just as instructive, showing how the thalassocratic model could be molded to fit different cultures and eras. The spiritual, ritual kingship of Srivijaya, which used Buddhism to legitimize its rule, stands in stark contrast to the cold, calculating merchant oligarchy of Venice. The loose, cooperative federation of the Hanseatic League is a world away from the top-down, state-driven imperial expansion of Great Britain. These variations teach us that there is no single formula for a floating empire. The model is a toolkit, and different societies will use its components' naval power, economic control, and cultural influence in different proportions based on their unique historical context. What unites them all is the revolutionary idea that the greatest power doesn't always lie in controlling the land, but in mastering the pathways that connect it. The ghost of Srivijaya still collects its toll, not in gold or spices, but in the relentless flow of 21st century commerce. Look at any modern map of global shipping lanes, and you'll see a digital echo of the ancient water highways, a glowing web of connection that traces coastlines first mapped by Phoenician and Srivijayan sailors. The very concept of globalization, so often discussed as a modern phenomenon, finds its deepest roots not in the internet age, but in the hold of a wooden ship sailing the monsoon winds. The Strait of Malacca, that vital artery controlled so masterfully by Srivijaya, is now arguably the most critical economic choke point on the planet. Nearly a third of all global maritime trade passes through its narrow confines today. Container ships the size of cities carrying everything from Chinese electronics to Saudi crude oil. The strategic calculation remains unchanged. Control the pinch point, and you influence the economy of the world. Modern nations don't station tax collectors on the waves, but they exercise their influence through naval patrols, port security agreements, and complex international laws of the sea, all of which are the direct descendants of the thalassocratic principle that he who commands the corridor commands the commerce. This ancient legacy is physically embedded in the skylines of the world's greatest port cities. Take Singapore, a tiny island nation with negligible natural resources that has become a global economic titan. Its entire existence is a modern thalassocratic manifesto. Like ancient Palembang, its power derives almost exclusively from its strategic location along the Strait of Malacca and its genius for facilitating trade. It operates one of the world's busiest ports, a sprawling, automated marvel that is the modern equivalent of a Srivijayan harbor, a place where goods are efficiently transferred, value is added through refining and processing, and wealth is generated through logistics and finance rather than agriculture or conquest. Dubai is another stunning example, a city that has quite literally willed itself into existence on the basis of trade and connectivity, transforming a sleepy creek into a global hub for air and sea freight, following the same blueprint of leveraging geographic position into unparalleled economic influence. The economic tools themselves bear the fingerprints of these ancient mariners. The concept of a free port, a zone where goods can be landed, handled, and re-exported without paying import duties, is a direct evolution of the tax-free safe havens offered by Thalassocracies to attract merchants. Modern free trade agreements are the complex, legalistic grandchildren of the simple pacts negotiated between a Phoenician merchant and a local chieftain, agreements built on the mutual benefit of open exchange. Even the practice of naval diplomacy, where a country projects power and secures its interests through the visible presence of its fleet, is a page taken directly from the Thalassocratic playbook. The United States' 7th Fleet, patrolling the Pacific to ensure freedom of navigation, is performing a role that would be instantly recognizable to the captain of a Srivijayan patrol boat 1600 years ago. The technology has changed, but the strategic imperative remains. Perhaps the most profound continuity, however, lies in the enduring challenges. The pirates that preyed on Phoenician grain ships and Srivijayan spice junks have not vanished, they have simply adapted. Modern piracy off the coast of Somalia or in the Strait of Malacca itself is a brutal reminder that the lucrative concentration of wealth on the high seas will always attract predators, requiring constant vigilance and international cooperation to suppress. The environmental impact of maritime trade, once limited to local pollution from harbor activities, has now escalated into a global conversation about carbon emissions from massive container ships and the ecological damage caused by oil spills. And the geopolitical competition over these watery corridors is more intense than ever, with rising naval powers challenging established orders, turning ancient highways into potential flashpoints for conflict. Recognizing this long lineage does not solve these modern problems, but it provides a crucial perspective. We are not facing unprecedented crises, but rather the latest iteration of challenges as old as organized seafaring itself. The solutions may require new technology, but the wisdom needed, the balance of power, the diplomacy of trade, the stewardship of the marine environment, is written in the wakes of history's first great floating empires. What if the most powerful lesson from the ancient world isn't about how to conquer land, but how to master connection? The floating empires of antiquity offer a stunningly modern playbook for power in our own interconnected age, demonstrating that true influence often lies not in occupying territory, but in controlling the vital pathways that link it together. Their strategies feel less like dusty history and more like a prophetic blueprint for the digital era, where data flows replace spice routes and network access is the new strategic choke point. The Phoenicians and Srivijaya understood that an empire could be built on a different kind of real estate, the liquid, dynamic space of movement and exchange. This principle translates directly to today's world, where a company like a major social media platform or a search engine doesn't own the physical infrastructure of the internet, yet it controls the digital highways where attention, commerce, and ideas converge. Their power is thalassocratic in nature. They rule not by owning the wires and servers, but by mastering the flow of information across them, taxing that flow with advertising revenue and data collection, much like Srivijaya taxed ships in the Malacca Strait. This suggests a profound shift in how we think about governance and strategy, moving from a model of hard borders and territorial control to one of network management and influence over systems of exchange. This ancient model champions adaptability as the ultimate survival tool. The Thalassocracies thrived because they were built to be fluid, to bend with the changing winds of politics, economics, and technology rather than break. They didn't dig moats and build static walls. They built faster ships and established flexible alliances. In a modern context, this underscores the critical weakness of rigid, monolithic institutions and the rising strength of agile, networked organizations. A large, traditional corporation anchored to outdated physical assets can be easily disrupted by a smaller, digital native competitor that operates like a floating empire leveraging cloud infrastructure, a global freelance workforce, and viral marketing to achieve influence without the burden of heavy capital investment. The lesson is clear. Resilience in the 21st century comes from the ability to pivot quickly, to abandon sinking routes and chart new ones, and to structure power around mobility and information rather than fixed, vulnerable assets. It's about building a system that is antifragile, one that actually gains from volatility and shock. Furthermore, these seafaring civilizations were early masters of soft power, recognizing that cultural and economic influence could often achieve what military force could not. Srivijaya didn't conquer Southeast Asia with armies. It attracted it with wealth, security, and the prestige of being a center of Buddhist learning. Its authority was rooted in its perceived value to everyone else. This is the essence of modern brand power and diplomatic influence. A nation today that invests in its cultural exports, its educational systems, and its reputation for innovation wields a form of soft power that can open doors and build alliances far more effectively than saber-rattling alone. Similarly, a tech giant that provides indispensable free tools to billions of people builds a reservoir of goodwill and dependency that is a far more durable source of power than coercion. The Thalassocracies teach us that the most enduring authority is often that which is invited, not imposed. It's the power of being the essential, beneficial node in a global network. However, their history also serves as a stark warning about the perils of over-specialization and fragile dependencies. The very source of a Thalassocracy's strength was also its greatest vulnerability. Srivijaya's magnificent wealth was entirely predicated on its control of a single geographic feature. When the monsoon patterns shifted slightly, when a new sultanate offered better terms, or when silt began to block its harbors, its entire economic foundation began to crumble. This is a cautionary tale for our own hyper-specialized global economy. A nation that relies on a single commodity for its wealth, or a corporation that depends on a single supply chain running through a geopolitical hotspot, is building its house on sand. The modern equivalent of silting harbors might be a sudden change in digital regulation, a breakthrough in technology that renders a current business model obsolete, or a pandemic that halts global movement. The lesson is not to avoid building networks, but to build redundancy into them, to diversify routes, develop multiple sources of revenue, and create systems that can withstand the failure of any single node. It's a call for strategic resilience, ensuring that our modern networks of power are robust and distributed enough to survive the inevitable shocks that will come. Ultimately, the floating empires compel us to think ethically about the nature of power in a connected world. Their history is not without its dark sides, including exploitation and the uneven benefits of trade. As we design the digital thalassocracies of the future, the platforms, currencies, and networks that will govern the flow of 21st century life, we have a responsibility to ask who benefits from this control. Are we building systems that, like the best aspects of these ancient networks, foster open exchange, cultural synthesis, and mutual prosperity? Or are we creating extractive, monopolistic models that simply replicate old imperial patterns in a new domain? The wisdom from the water highways is that power derived from connection carries with it a profound responsibility to sustain and protect the network itself. For today's leaders in government and business, the challenge is to harness the agility and innovative spirit of the Thalassocracies while consciously avoiding their fragility and ethical blind spots, crafting a future where our global networks are not just efficient, but also equitable and resilient. Despite the incredible discoveries pulled from shipwrecks and unearthed from ancient riverbanks, the history of these floating empires is still filled with tantalizing gaps and unresolved debates that keep historians awake at night. One of the most captivating mysteries revolves around the true limits of Phoenician exploration. While we know they sailed as far as Britain for tin and down the coast of Africa, some tantalizing, though highly controversial, evidence suggests they may have ventured much, much farther. A controversial inscription, known as the Paraíba inscription, allegedly found in Brazil in the 19th century, appeared to describe a Phoenician voyage that was blown off course. While most experts dismiss it as a modern hoax, the very idea sparks the imagination. Could these master mariners, with their sturdy ships and celestial navigation skills, have actually reached the Americas centuries before the Vikings and millennia before Columbus? The debate is a perfect example of how a single, unverified artifact can challenge our entire understanding of ancient capabilities, forcing us to question just how far these pioneers of the sea were willing to go. Equally perplexing is the relatively sudden and silent fading of the Srivijaya Empire from prominence. Here was a powerhouse that dominated one of the world's most critical trade routes for over 600 years, and yet its decline is not marked by a famous, recorded battle or a dramatic siege that we can point to. Instead, it seems to have simply unraveled. Was it a combination of factors? The silting of the Musi River slowly choking off access to the capital of Palembang. The rising power and aggression of the Javanese Majapahit Empire applying pressure from the east. Or perhaps a more subtle shift, the growing influence of Islamic sultanates like Malacca, which began to offer merchants a new, more appealing model of trade and governance that slowly drew business away from the old Buddhist kingdom. The lack of a clear, singular cause is itself a historical puzzle, suggesting that even the most resilient network-based empires can be undone by a slow-burning combination of economic, environmental, and political changes that are almost invisible in the moment. The challenge for archaeologists and historians is that these were empires built on wood and water, two materials that are notoriously unforgiving to the passage of time. Unlike the stone pyramids of Egypt or the brick walls of Mesopotamia, the primary infrastructure of a thalassocracy, its ships, its wooden docks, its harbor markets rot away and vanish. The written records are another huge hurdle. The Phoenicians, pragmatic to their core, often wrote on perishable papyrus or wax tablets for their daily business transactions, meaning the vast majority of their economic and administrative records have been lost forever. We have to infer the complexity of their trade from the cargoes of shipwrecks and the brief mentions in the records of their enemies, like the Assyrians or Greeks. For Srivijaya, the historical picture is painted almost entirely by external sources: Chinese pilgrims, Arab geographers, Indian scholars who visited their shores and wrote about them. The empire itself left frustratingly few of its own detailed chronicles, leaving us to piece together its internal workings from second-hand accounts and scattered stone inscriptions. This veil of mystery also extends to other, lesser-known but equally fascinating thalassocracies. The Chola dynasty of southern India, for instance, launched a breathtakingly audacious naval raid across the Indian Ocean in the 11th century, sacking the capital of Srivijaya itself. But was this a one-off military expedition, or did it represent a sustained, deliberate effort to build a Chola maritime empire? The evidence is fragmentary and hotly debated. Similarly, the Omani Arabs of the later period established a vast commercial network that stretched from the Persian Gulf to Zanzibar, yet their story is often overshadowed by the age of European colonialism that followed. The full extent of their influence and the sophistication of their maritime operations are only beginning to be fully appreciated. Each of these gaps in our knowledge is an open invitation, a reminder that the map of the ancient maritime world is still being drawn, and that every new discovery on the seafloor or in a dusty archive has the potential to rewrite the history books and deepen our awe for these masters of the ocean. Yet the very brilliance of these maritime networks casts a long and complex shadow, one that demands our honest attention alongside our admiration. To paint these floating empires solely as benevolent connectors of the world is to ignore the harsh realities that often underpin their prosperity. The same ships that carried spices and silk could also be, and often were, vessels for the brutal traffic in human beings. The Phoenicians, in particular, were notorious in the ancient world for their involvement in the slave trade, capturing people from coastal communities across the Mediterranean and selling them in distant markets. This wasn't a peripheral activity, it was a core and profitable component of their commerce, a grim reminder that the economic fluidity they championed could have a devastating human cost. Similarly, the cultural melting pots of Srivijaya, while celebrated for their diversity, were likely built upon systems of labor that we would recognize today as deeply exploitative. The wealth that built magnificent Buddhist stupas and funded grand universities may well have been extracted from an underclass of workers, their stories lost to history but their labor essential to the empire's glittering facade. Beyond the social impact, these empires also left a mark on the very environment they so skillfully navigated. The Phoenician hunger for the magnificent cedar trees of Lebanon led to widespread deforestation, stripping mountainsides and altering local ecosystems to feed their endless need for shipbuilding timber. In Southeast Asia, the intense concentration of shipping and settlement around strategic ports like Palembang would have placed immense pressure on local resources: clean water, fertile land for food, and forests for building materials, potentially displacing local communities and degrading the environment long before the concept of sustainability existed. Furthermore, their role as cultural hubs while fostering exchange also involved a powerful degree of assimilation. Local traditions, languages, and beliefs in port cities could be gradually absorbed or overwritten by the dominant commercial and religious cultures promoted by the empire, leading to a subtle erosion of indigenous identity in the name of cosmopolitan unity. This isn't about applying modern moral judgments to ancient civilizations. It's about striving for a complete and honest historical portrait. Modern historians grapple with this balance constantly, working to acknowledge the full spectrum of these empires' legacy, their breathtaking innovation, and their profound impact, both positive and negative. This ethical approach allows us to learn from the past in a far more meaningful way. The challenges of maritime sovereignty, of who controls the sea lanes and to what end, are directly descended from the Thalassocratic model, lessons crucial for navigating modern disputes in the South China Sea or the Arctic. The struggle to preserve cultural heritage against the forces of globalization finds a parallel in the ancient tension between cosmopolitan ports and their surrounding communities. And the pursuit of economic justice forces us to ask who truly benefited from these vast networks of trade and who paid the price. By looking at history with clear eyes, we gain not just a sense of wonder, but a toolkit for understanding the complexities of our own interconnected world, ensuring that our celebration of human achievement is always tempered by a compassionate understanding of its consequences. There's a profound and enduring romance to the idea of an empire that floats, a power that exists in the constant motion of the waves rather than the static permanence of stone. This isn't just a historical concept, it's a powerful narrative that has captivated the human spirit for millennia, tapping into something deep within our collective psyche. We are, after all, a species of explorers and storytellers, and the tales of these seafaring civilizations speak directly to our innate desire for adventure and our awe of the unknown. Think about the stories that have shaped our imagination, the epic voyages of Sinbad the Sailor, braving monstrous whales and magical islands, the legendary journeys of Odysseus, whose 10-year struggle to return home across the wine-dark sea is a foundational pillar of Western literature. These aren't just fictions, they are narrative echoes of the very real, perilous, and wondrous journeys undertaken by Phoenician and Srivijayan merchants, their real-life adventures blurring the line between history and myth to fuel our dreams for centuries. This allure is powerfully tied to a sense of nostalgia for a world that felt vast, uncharted, and brimming with mystery. In our modern era of satellite imagery and instant global communication, every corner of the map has been photographed and catalogued. The oceans are highways we take for granted, their routes predictable and their dangers largely mitigated. But the world of the Thalassocracy was the opposite, a place of breathtaking possibility and terrifying uncertainty. To set sail from the coast of Lebanon was to literally disappear over the horizon into a void, trusting only the stars, the wind, and one's own skill to find a distant shore that might as well have been another world. This element of the unknown, the potential for discovering something, or somewhere completely new, injects their history with a thrilling sense of possibility that we can still feel when we read about them today. It represents a time when courage and curiosity were the most valuable currencies, and a single successful voyage could rewrite the known world. This romantic appeal is constantly reinforced and reimagined in our popular culture, proving that the archetype of the maritime adventurer is eternally resonant. The entire genre of pirate lore, from Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island to the blockbuster Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, draws directly from this wellspring. These stories are built on the same core ingredients: hidden treasures, cosmopolitan ports filled with colorful characters, swift ships offering freedom from land-bound laws, and the vast, untamed ocean as both a setting and a character. Modern documentaries spend millions recreating these ancient ships and tracing their routes, allowing us to marvel at their craftsmanship and live vicariously through their voyages. Even our language is peppered with phrases from this seafaring past. We talk of navigating a difficult situation, weathering a storm, or being on an even keel, unconsciously keeping the metaphor of the maritime journey alive in our daily lives. Ultimately, engaging with these stories is about more than just escapism. It's a way for us to connect with a fundamental thread of the human experience, the relentless drive to push boundaries, to seek out new horizons, and to dream on a grand scale. The floating empires stand as a testament to what we can achieve when we are not limited by the ground beneath our feet, when we dare to use our ingenuity to turn barriers into highways. They remind us that some of the greatest human achievements are born not from conquest and domination, but from connection and curiosity. By setting sail with these ancient mariners in our minds, we honor a shared heritage of exploration and keep alive the spirit of adventure that continues to propel us forward, even if our oceans are now made of data and stars. And so, as our voyage charts its final course, we're left with a profound realization: the legacy of these floating empires is not confined to history books. It's woven into the very fabric of our modern world. The Phoenician and Srivijayan approach to power, centered on connection rather than conquest, offers a timeless blueprint. They understood that true influence often flows through networks, not borders, and that prosperity is built by facilitating exchange, not just by hoarding territory. This ancient wisdom feels startlingly relevant today as we navigate our own complex web of digital highways, global supply chains, and international alliances. The challenges they mastered managing long-distance communication, fostering cooperation among diverse cultures, and adapting to shifting economic winds are the very same challenges that define our 21st century. Perhaps their most crucial lesson is one of resilience through adaptability. These were not rigid, brittle superpowers. They were fluid, agile networks that could bend with the storms of change. When a trade route was threatened, they found another. When a new cultural force emerged, they integrated it. When their technology was surpassed, they innovated. In an era of accelerating climate change and geopolitical instability, this flexibility is more vital than ever. The Thalassocracies teach us that survival depends not on building higher walls, but on building better ships, on our capacity to pivot, to learn, and to collaborate in the face of the unknown. Their respect for the natural world, their understanding that they were guests navigating a powerful and unpredictable environment, stands as a critical reminder for our own relationship with the planet. Ultimately, the story of the water highways is a story of human ingenuity and our endless desire to reach beyond the horizon. It's a testament to the fact that some of our greatest achievements are born from cooperation and curiosity, not conflict and domination. Thank you for embarking on this journey through time with me. I'd love to hear which of these floating empires you find most fascinating. Was it the commercially brilliant Phoenicians or the strategically masterful Srivijaya? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed unearthing these historical mysteries, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the past. Until our next adventure, keep exploring.